Alfred Kinsey. That's one of the happiest, best pictures I could find of him. He had a lot of really like creepy pictures, and I was tempted to use one of them. But I thought somebody might think I'm just taking a cheap shot at the guy because he was a creep. Do you know who Kinsey was?
She just filled me in.
Okay, so you know what you're getting into. Okay.
I do.
And that's not what this class is about.
Walked in, so
But
sorry.
it is a book that screwed up the world, so that's what we did. So just biographical, he was born in 1894, died in 1956. Interestingly, his book was published in 48, so it was all theory until much later. So he didn't get to see how bad things got. And really, even the beginning of the 60s and the sexual revolution, I think everyone was still into this fake delusion that, yeah, this is the way it should be. You know, taking Rousseau and him and Simone, Margaret Mead that we read last week, and pretending this is freedom. So he never got to see, you know, all of the negative consequences of it. He taught zoology and botany. He started out at Harvard. The interesting thing with the last couple of weeks, it struck me as I was reading it. Remember at the beginning of the study, it was all Europe. These are all European. The last several have been homegrown. So we're contributing to the world getting messed up now too. Yay us. I guess before is because some of these books were written before the United States existed or was even discovered. In the case of, hey, it's my mom. I gotta change the subject now. If you guys don't know, this is my mom Sharon. She's visiting from Augusta. But he taught at Harvard and then joined Indiana University in 1920 and founded the Center of Institute of Sex Research. He founded it, but then later, it was well after his death, they named it the Kinsey Institute for Sex and Research. Sex, Gender, and Reproduction. Now, given the war going through now in our culture with the LGBTQ activists, you can see what they've done here. Research in sex, gender, and reproduction. So I was kind of poking around at their site a little bit, and sure enough, they're using his research or his legacy to justify all the things that the LGBTQ plus movement is trying to promote. And you can see why. If you read the chapter, like, yeah, this is exactly what they would want to latch onto, which I don't understand why somebody would want to latch onto this man, even if, just like we were talking about with what's her name, with Planned Parenthood, they've been distancing themselves from her because she was she was racist, she was not a very good person, but the eugenics part they thought was good, so they hang on to her enough, but they don't really celebrate her a lot on their website. These guys seem to still celebrate him. So he wrote two books. 1948 was the first one, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and then I think it was 54, so just shortly after that, The Human Female. Most of it was based on the same research. Hey, don't worry, we had your kids leave the room so that you wouldn't have to worry about it.
So they wouldn't interrupt you?
No, they're usually really good. Which is basically the same. This is the stuff, yeah. Look at his face. It's like, oh man, I should have stayed at McDonald's. Should have stayed at Chick-fil-A, right? Just like last week, we had the coming of age in Samoa, and she was an anthropologist, and she went to the Samoan tribe, and I can't remember which island it was, but Pacific island, and observed these people, and wrote down her observations. But it wasn't for decades until the scientific community, the anthropology community, started to critique her and say, wait a second, this is not scientific research, you're just writing down anecdotal observations. That's not how you do anthropology. You go and you say, you know, of the X number of females in this tribe that are of this age and below, this behavior was observed and so on. It's scientific. You can actually put rigor to it. She didn't do that. She just said, oh, I saw this and this is how they live. And there was even some accusations that some of the girls, the teenage girls that she was interviewing, were just messing with her. They actually, there's evidence that...
Like a hoaxer?
Yeah, they were just screwing around with her. They were just, yeah, and then we do this. And she said, oh, really? Oh, wow, that's amazing. She wasn't a very good researcher, and she had a predetermined narrative that she was just looking for evidence to fill. And even the, I won't say secular community, because I hate that word used too much, but the that community, anthropological,
Yeah.
is the word? Okay. Community has said that the evidence says she's completely wrong, but her methods and her data should not be taken as rigorous or as authoritative as other statistics. Same thing with Kinsey. In the 90s, actually it was the early 80s that it first started to get criticized by people who weren't, from the evangelical community. And they were, in fact, one of them, this lady here, I think might be a Christian, Judith Reisman. This is who I found, but this was written in the late 90s. Very damning. I mean, it's just called Crimes and Consequences. Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences. And she just goes through, in fact, there's a couple pictures in here. This is where I was getting disturbed. Just the stuff that they did. Yeah, there's a little picture. I have it. This little girl. It was one of the girls that he was interviewing to ask her about her sexual practices. And of course, he didn't use those words. He used other words, but she talks about it in here. But I got some good information out of it. But to the science, to speak to the statistics, the science, because he's trying to sell himself as, look, I'm just trying to do science here. If you're against what I'm doing, then you're just anti-science. See, I'm at a university, I got a government grant, you must just be a Puritan or something, or an irrational Christian, religious zealot if you have any problem with what I'm doing. That was his tone he was striking. So what about the science? Statistics, as you know, you have to have a representation, because you don't interview every single person in the United States to find out what percentage of people think what. You have to have a sampling that's representative. It's a random sampling, but it does represent the whole population. So you work very hard to make sure you have different economic, if you're trying to find something out about the nation as a whole, so poor, middle class, upper class, different race ethnicities, rural, urban, you have to mix it up so that it's representative of what Americans live like, think like, act like, and then you find out what they report. And I don't even know what the number is, because I didn't have to take statistics as a psych minor, only as a psych major, so we got away from that one. But you have to have a certain, so if you have 1 million people, does anybody know statistics? You like math.
I'm taking statistics.
What's if you have 1 million people, there's a statistically relevant sample base.
Oh, yeah.
What's that number? It's a certain percentage, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's amazing, it's only 1,000 or something that you have to.
High,
and for some reason, statisticians have done research where they've only had 1,000, and then they had several thousand, and they saw no difference, or a minor amount of difference in the results. And so they figured out what's the threshold that you need in order to get a statistically relevant data. So the sample size, he interviewed about 1,500 people through the course of his whole study before he died, but the sample size was skewed. Hundreds of people that he interviewed, so and I've been talking about thousands of people that he interviewed, so say it's around 1,500. Hundreds of them were male prostitutes. So now if you extrapolate that would mean 20-30% of the American population are male prostitutes. I mean, that's obviously not representative, and we just know that by tax returns, what people do for a living. So that was a problem that the critics started pointing out. 25% of the people that he used in his studies were sex offenders. They were ex-cons for sexual crimes. It wasn't like they stole, cards or stole the bubble gum. I mean, these were sex offenders that were tried, convicted, served time, or fined or whatever, but they were sex offenders. 25%. Are 25% of Americans sex offenders? No. So he's far lopsiding his data. And then the other thing that this book pointed out that I thought was interesting, for the children, it's illegal for him to have a minor in there alone, and so he had to, had to do this burdensome thing of having the parent present. What kind of a parent? think about the mindset, the political convictions, the religious convictions. What type of a mindset would a parent have to say, yeah, I'll bring my 5-year-old girl in to get interviewed about whether or not she's had multiple orgasms? Those are the questions he was asking. So the skew, just by what he was trying to research, the types of people. Should I close that door? Someone's going to walk by and I'm going to get in trouble. Actually, it's okay as long as I don't say old.
You might want to close the door there.
So 25% sex offenders, hundreds of them were male prostitutes.
Just get a kid walking
One's
by
out there.
from school or something.
And of the people who we would call normal or representative of the nation, at least for the children that were part of his study, because he interviewed a number of children, they already self-selected because none of us are going to let our kids be part of something like that. And so they're not going to have any conservative, Christian, Jewish, anybody that has traditional values wouldn't go anywhere near this study. So obviously the data is almost completely irrelevant. All you can say is, well, of the people who make up this fringe of society that have problems to begin with, yeah, over half of them fall into this category, like he said. But he's trying to say that over half of Americans fall into these categories. So you see just the scientific problem with what he did. Now I put that picture in there. This is a picture, the famous picture of one of the girls. Now he didn't, there's no evidence direct that he was doing anything to these children, but there's rumors of at least that he was a pedophile himself. So I don't know, I didn't want to say that, definitively unless I had like a case study or something. But I do know that this is a picture of one of the girls that he interviewed. I think she was 5 or 6 years old. They didn't even know what her name was. This book is where I got it. But he would do coloring exercises, just trying to earn their trust, and then start to ask them questions that would be more about fantasies or sexual practices or any encounters they've had with friends, relatives, and he would just catalog it. And what he was trying to do is, and this is somebody trying to find justification for their beliefs, there were 3 groups that he, 3 ways he got his data. One of them was interviewing adults and asking them to recollect about what they remember when they were 5 years old, for example. He went all the way back to infancy, and he did research, and I don't even know how he got this. I didn't want to get, honestly, I was getting disgusted by reading up on this, and I just didn't want to stop. But he, in his data, was talking about how often infants have orgasms. How does he know that? And if he should be locked up, he should have been locked up, and this is criminal. I'm just baffled that in the 1940s that this just, everyone said, oh. Anyway, it was disgusting. So he was, obviously adults can't recollect what they were like as infants, but we have some memories of when we were 5 and 6 years old. But his theory was people are selectively remembering or blocking certain things out, or they weren't thinking that clearly. Things they thought were one thing at 5 years old were actually something else. The only way I can really get that information is to interview 5-year-olds, and that's what he did. This part of it is so adults remembering, actually interviewing the children in the 3rd category. I can't remember. If you realize, I thought that was actually interesting. You know how each chapter started off with a quote, but this one didn't have a quote. I thought, what's up with that? But he explains it right away, that the Kinsey Institute would not give Ben Weicker permission to quote the book. Did you guys catch that? I mean, it was on the first few pages. Out of all the books, and some pretty messed up books, even people like organizations like Planned Parenthood let him quote their source. They would not give him copyright permission just to do block quotes or even sentences. So there's not a single quote. That's why I had to go out and find some, because I'm like, I'm not going to let Kinsey get away with that. That's messed up. I mean, there's something wrong with your namesake if, as an institute, you don't want anyone really knowing, especially critics, knowing what he said for real, because his own words would be so condemning. So I just put a couple of them up here, and these are the cleaner ones. So I didn't try to get shock value. Males do not represent two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not to be divided into sheep and goats, and not all things are black nor all things white. It is a fundamental of taxonomy that nature rarely deals with discrete categories. Only the human mind invents categories and tries to force facts into separate pigeonholes. The living world is a continuum in each and every one of its aspects. The sooner we learn this concerning human sexual behavior, the sooner we shall reach a sound understanding of the realities of sex. A couple things to point out there is he's pigeonholing human sexuality the way he categorizes. He says specifically, I'm trying to undermine traditional conservative religious views. He says that those traditional conservative religious views of sexuality and family are damaging people. It's harmful. Well, isn't that pigeonholing? He's going into it with an agenda. So once again, just the hypocrisy of many of the books that we've seen. The only kinds of sexual dysfunction are abstinence, celibacy, and delayed marriage. He's very open-minded about conservative values.
Jared, can you go back?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
I do want that one.
That's the best.
Oh, there's a better one. The last one I put on here is like,
Oh my goodness, man.
it's short to the point, and he's not trying to hide anything. If all persons with any trace of homosexual history or those who were predominantly homosexual were eliminated from the population today, there is no reason for believing that the incidence of the homosexual in the next generation would be materially reduced. The homosexual has been a significant part of human sexual activity since the dawn of history, primarily because it is an expression of capacities that are basic in the human animal. So he's not being a very good Darwinist there, number one. So if homosexuality is something that is passed on genetically, then of course it would have been out of the gene pool a long time ago because they don't reproduce, obviously. So in one part of his quote, he's denying a animalistic common ancestry, with modification. Then here he's calling it an animal. So here's Darwin, here's the antithesis of Darwin. So even in his own, it's not as obviously a self-contradiction, but I think there's a tension in his own beliefs there.
When was this written again?
48, published in 48. He was writing it. This is the one I thought was the only unnatural sex act is that which you cannot perform. Okay, so what does that mean? Everything, and he meant everything is on the table. And he talked a bunch about it in here. I think you saw that he was promoting bestiality. Mm-hmm. Everything was on the table, and we'll go to that later. Okay. So Weicker, instead of asking the old-fashioned question, how should we act, Kinsey asked the seemingly scientific question, how do we act? So it's not should, but how do people act? Teleology, what's the problem with that way of Kinsey's approach?
There is a purpose to sex.
The should is a teleological category. There's a way things ought to be because we have natures. Natures are a certain thing that you either are close to, and that's called the good, or you're frustrating it or working against it, and that's called evil. There's a design, there's a telos, there's a nature. So obviously the question Kinsey has to deal with is, are there natures? Are there such a thing? Is there such a thing as human nature? Which of course would include sexuality, would include relationships, would include all the things that make a person a good person are entailed in what we mean when we say human nature. So back to, he was an atheist. He talks a little bit about that. I read more in this book about his atheism. He was pretty adamant atheist. I mean, he hated God, Christians, and so, but just like with Freud, you remember when we dealt with Freud, he just assumed it never examined it, never looked at the arguments for God's existence and the arguments against God's existence, weighed them, looked at the premises. I mean, it's a pretty big, important question. If your whole system, in Kinsey's case for sure, is based on God not existing, you ought to do a little homework, especially if you're an academic like he was. Why do you think there is no God? You have to at least put a chapter of that in your dissertation. God doesn't exist for these reasons. Now that God doesn't exist, here humans must just be material. If humans are just material, I mean, that's how a person who's trying to do good scholarship would do it. But he didn't, because he wasn't trying to do good scholarship. Okay, I got this from Texas State University's website. We're going to talk about the is-ought fallacy that we brought up last week. And I thought it was interesting because it's a state school, and you'll see a couple of their quotes in here that you would be, that's a weird example. I didn't even put them all in there. But I wanted to show that the is-ought fallacy is not something we Christian apologists talk about. Philosophy talks about this. If you're just doing run-of-the-mill analytic philosophy or classical philosophy, you deal with this fallacy called the is-ought fallacy, or the problem of going from an is to an ought. So the is-ought fallacy occurs when the assumption is made that because things are a certain way, they should be that way. It can also consist of the assumption that because something is not now occurring, this means that it should not occur. The negative of it's the same argument, but negative. In effect, this fallacy asserts that the status quo should be maintained simply for its own sake. It seeks to make a value of a fact or to derive a moral imperative from the description of a state of affairs. When we talked about, or we went through Freud, that was one of the mistakes he was making. Is he would examine people, he would observe them, ask them questions, and these are the things people are reporting to me, their fantasies, their neuroses. This is just the way it is, so it ought to be that way. People have these fantasies and these problems. The problems that people are having are similar to what he's saying here. The neuroses that people experience is because they think it's wrong to think these thoughts or to do these actions. So we can just dispel them from this idea that it's wrong, then they won't have neuroses. That was one of his pillars, one of the pillars of his system. So he took an is, meaning you guys get what is ought. That makes sense. Okay, can't go from an is. In other words, something just happens to be the case. So well, it ought to be that way then. That's what the fallacy is. That means everything that you're presented with is by definition moral or ethical or should be that way. Shouldn't be tried to be changed. On that same website, Texas University, they just gave some examples. We do not this is an example of the fallacy. We do not currently regulate the amount of nicotine in an individual cigarette, therefore we need not do this. If nature does not make it, meaning like Mother Nature, not philosophical nature. If Mother Nature does not make it, we shouldn't have it. So living like Rousseau's Natural Man, right? Of course, homosexuality is immoral. You don't see any animals doing that. That's on their site, because this is actually the opposite of what Kinsey says. But I just wanted to show that they have that on there. They're kind of taking a jab at us on that one. The simple fact is that war is good for mankind, since the tendency to conflict is a human instinct. And they had others in there too. The is-ought fallacy, civil rights. Why in the world do we fight for civil rights? Because the way things were, it should just have been left, right? It's the is-ought. It ought to be this way, where not every human being is created the same. In fact, maybe they're not all human. Maybe the Aborigines, the Africans, the Pygmies, these aren't actually human in the same way that the Europeans and the Scandinavians are human. That was the argument, right? The eugenic stuff that we covered is ought fallacy. We ought to just left it alone. But no, everybody on the left even would have wanted to and did fight against injustices, racial injustices. So people are even selective on their application of the is ought. So they'll fight against racism. We're with them on that. They fight against, which we would agree with this too, violence against people because they're gay or because they're trans, beating them up, killing them, yeah, that's wrong. We would fight against that too. But then you get to sexual behavior of the human male, and they're using the is-ought fallacy. This is the way people report to have these experiences as kids, so it must be natural. Even worse, animals, animals do these behaviors, the is, therefore nature ought to be permissive of this. It's only the stuffy Christian religious Puritan culture that is creating this neurosis of, oh gosh, I feel guilty, I shouldn't think this or do this or act on this. That's the problem, is that you're trying to suppress it, not the desire in the first place. So looking to the animal kingdom and how to determine how we should behave, how humans should behave. So I love what he did, because he's a farm boy. He got what he's talking about with chickens and roosters. First of all, roosters on the farm are violent rapists. A rooster will go around and just attack every hen, and the hens, even if they're screaming at the top of their lungs, doesn't matter, he's going to do what he's going to do. And he said that when they first got a rooster, they put up with it for like 3 days, and then finally they separated the rooster and they ate him. Because they said they were just tired of the noise, because this is how the animal kingdom behaves. So by that logic, by Kinsey's logic, violent rapists should be encouraged. The animals do it all the time. They do it. And that was just one example of one species. He talked about all sorts of other species. Kinsey himself even points to the animal kingdom to say, look at how many times animals will have, not intercourse, because it's not intercourse if you can't reproduce, but will have the act out intercourse on other species. So, a funny example in our world is when a dog, you go over to someone's house and the male dog wants to have fun on your leg. Does that mean he's a legosexual? No. This is just animals. We would say they have an instinct that God gave them so that procreation can happen readily in the animal kingdom, and they're not moral agents, so they just act out in this impulse on inanimate objects and other species, on multiple of their own species. So he's saying that behavior in animals, so multiple partners, indiscriminate. Also, like Rousseau said, you remember Rousseau talked about the man should just have, and women, just have indiscriminate sex and then move on. It's sort of like grazing as a cow. You just graze the field and move on. He was saying that's a good thing, because that's what the animals do. That's what the man used to be like. He had no evidence for that, but he said that's what man was in our original state, so that's what we should be, to be truly happy. So Kinsey was saying the same thing, because we see it in the animal kingdom. And then so he tries to justify that behavior, including bestiality. He offended bestiality, because animals act this way. What Weicker points out, he only used a few examples, but the rooster. So the rooster, you're saying, what about violent rape? Are you condoning that? Now, Kinsey privately probably would have. You look at his lifestyle, you look at things he believed. But he publicly would have said, no, we can't have violent rapists out there. Why not? Look at the way the hen acts. Chickens, so hens. If there's a defective chick that's born, you saw what he wrote in there? The hens, the female hens, will gather around and pick it to death. They will kill the chick. So,
And eat it.
yeah, and then eat it. So then he gets right. He moves to cannibalism, and he gives several examples. And it's just you'll spend years researching and studying the amount of cannibalism and murder and behavior like eating the young in the animal kingdom. So the question is, for Kinsey, why did you stop at just the sexual practices, and only the sexual practices that you think are like you're willing to say, multiple partners basically? But the violent rape side of things you didn't want to affirm. The eating the young you didn't want to affirm. The trans species, we'll put it this way, the lion. Who does the lion always kill when he's chasing the gazelles in the wild? It's the cripple. The slowest of the gazelles that can't run fast enough to get away is the one that gets eaten. So what are you saying? That, and of course Nietzsche and Hitler and Sanger and the eugenicists would say, yes, exactly, let them die. right? They would say the best thing for humanity is to get those bad genes out of the gene pool. But people like Kinsey wouldn't want to say that, but you have to. If you're going to look to the animal kingdom to find out how we should live, then you get all of this in there with it that nobody would want to say yes to. But that to me is the best, without getting into the philosophy that we are going to get into, that's the best apologetic against his system, is just learn, the stuff we learned in here, these two examples, the chicks getting eaten by the hens, if they're born defective, and then the violent rape practices of the roosters. And then, you can think of others in the animal kingdom, and just start reciting them to somebody and say, do you really think that that's how we should behave as humans? And if they say yes, I mean, they're either lying, messing with you, or they're sick. And nowadays, they might be sick. There are people saying things that I never thought our fellow citizens would be fighting for, and they are. So I don't put it past people now, but most people are going to want to say, no, I obviously don't want us to be eating each other or killing the young that are infirm or violent rape, things like that. Okay, so then we agree the animal kingdom is not a place to look to find out how we're supposed to be as humans. And the whole idea of us being even labeled the human animal is problematic. We're animals in the sense that, as opposed to plants, we're not plants. We're not inanimate, inorganic beings. So we're animals in that sense. The Bible affirms that. But we're made in the image of God. There's something different about us. By the way, here's another side thing. The church used to say that we were a completely different thing than the animal kingdom. And so we had this radical otherness than the animal kingdom. And then when science started to discover things like, well, we have similar body designs, and then ultimately when we found out that DNA, that we have the exact same alphabetical code in our DNA as animals have in theirs, that caused a problem for that belief, and it was looked at as a defeater for the Christian worldview by the atheist science community, because we had propped up this false notion that animals and humans are completely separate. Why is it that it's important to acknowledge that we're not completely separate? This is actually not, I'm not even being spiritual here, this is just...
Because it's true.
That, right.
We have the same creator.
Right, common source. I'm even thinking something more mundane than that.
We were given dominion over the animals.
Yeah, so there's a relationship thing there that we're not given, well, I guess we're given dominion over rocks, but it's a different kind of relationship. If animals weren't similar to us, we wouldn't eat them, and they wouldn't nourish us. I mean, the nutrients that we get from animals and plants is what gets recycled, and it doesn't get broken apart, to the atom and then reassembled. We would all explode if stuff like that was happening, if atoms were being split. And all.
Sometimes it feels that way.
Mexican food can feel like atoms splitting. We eat the animals, we eat the plants. Our body does some basic chemical reactions, and it's what keeps us alive. If we were completely different, so there's a design element to it. It makes sense that God would want to make us with the same basic DNA. It's not basic, it's exactly the same DNA. Which, by the way, is an argument against Darwinian evolution, because a one-celled amoeba that is supposedly similar to the first living creature has the exact same DNA that you do. So it's not the case that life started simple and evolved to complex. The digital code that makes life what it is was exactly the complexity that it is today in us. And that happened instantly. So, Darwinist, how did that happen in slow, gradual steps? That this complex computer code suddenly appeared in inorganic matter, gets a code, and starts to reproduce? Now that's where you have, I don't have enough faith to believe that. It's more rational to say something outside the system was introduced. Outside the system, in this case, of course, is the system of nature. That's God. I digress, but that's one of the arguments for against Darwinism and for Creator at the same time.
Not any evolution fossils either.
Right, they'll point to like the Archaeopteryx and a few others that are not good examples. But right, that's the fossil evidence. If I could, I would do a whole class just on Darwinism.
Do it. You can.
Well, I can't. I'd have to not say a lot of things, but yeah, the absence of fossils. In fact, many biologists are starting to, or paleontologists, are admitting that, look, given the number of transitions between, say, a dog and a horse, you would expect to find a number of transition species, but we find none. And some very sketchy one. Archaeopteryx is a dinosaur that had feathers, and not a whole slew of feathers, but had some feathers. And that's one of the reasons that the theory that dinosaurs evolved into birds came about, is because they found this Archaeopteryx and thought it was a transition species. There are a whole lot of reasons why that's not an example. You can read the Discovery Institute has a bunch of good books. Icons of Evolution would be a good one, just to feed that one, because Darwinists don't use that for the most part anymore, but that's an example given. But yeah, paleontology is really interesting to me. Okay, Ben Weicker, we're gonna get philosophical now. Instead of what's that character? Philosophical. The Looney Tunes guy. The cat or the
Sylvester?
Sylvester. Okay, I didn't mean to say it that way, but it came out. Here we have an interesting legacy of Descartes, who gave us the dualist self, a spirit trapped in a machine. When the spirit dropped out and full-blown mechanism was accepted, the path was cleared for the expression of human sexuality as a merely mechanical response. Okay, several things to say before we start. Who was not here when we did Descartes? When Adam came and did that? You weren't. And you weren't. Al, that's right, you weren't either. Adam Tucker came and did our lesson on Descartes, Discourse of Reason. Descartes is the philosopher who was a Christian. Descartes was a born-again Christian, but he was a mathematician, and he wanted to have the same kind of certainty about the things of faith that he did about 2 + 2 is 4. He said, math is cool, you get all this certainty, there's no arguing about these quantities and these formulas, it just is what it is. I want that same approach to the Christian faith. Of course, right off the bat, it's like saying I want, mathematical certainty about whether King Tut lived or who the first president was. It's an historical category. Math is the wrong discipline. It has the wrong tools to even evaluate it. So he was doing that. He was trying to be mathematical about a philosophical question. Does God exist? Is Christianity true? So that's what Descartes was trying to do. So what he did is he introduced the skepticism that said, my senses can be tricked. So if they can be tricked, they can't be trusted. So I see this book in front of me, but how do I know there's a book there? Because I know that my eyesight can be tricked, my feeling, my sense of touch, my smell, they can all be tricked. So I have to have the skepticism about whether or not there's a book here. He introduced this gap. It's called the epistemological gap or knowledge gap.
Sorry.
You have an object of knowing, and you have the knower, us. There's a gap between us. And he's like, how do we fill this gap? How do we fill this gap? And so he introduced this thing called I think, therefore I am, and that was his way of building up a way of being pretty certain that you know there's a book here, but you can't really know for sure. And that's where skepticism was born. I'm shorthanding that whole lesson here, just because this won't make any sense if we don't do that. Christians came along in recent decades and have said, okay, there's this gap between the natural world and the external world and me as a knower. What do I use to fill that gap? The Bible. I use the Bible to fill the gap. I want to have a biblical worldview. I want to believe, is that biblical? The Bible should be the basis of all our beliefs. And that sounds really spiritual. Problem is, it's an answer to something that isn't a problem. Descartes introduced something that's not real, this gap between the knowledge of the knower and the object. And people, philosophers, both atheists, Christian, Buddhists, have been trying to fill that gap ever since. The classical philosophers, and this is even like Aristotle, this isn't necessarily a Christian thing. Aristotle would have said, there's no gap. You have getting into the forms and everything. If in the shorthand way of Richard Howe saying it, the guy that was in that video, he says, look, if this book, tasting it, smelling it, if this book isn't enough to convince you there's a book here, then giving an argument to fill in that gap is just another step removed. I can't help you if you can't believe your senses and your intellect. That's a shorthand way of saying the classical way of understanding how humans know. So that's the answer to Descartes. Add to that, so Descartes has this knowledge gap. He also has this gap between the soul and the spirit, and that's called dualism. And the one thing I need to say is that Christians are split on this. Whether or not dualism is the right way, and I mean good, conservative Christian philosophers. Dualism is this idea that your body and your spirit are completely separate substances. And Christians who believe this would say, we know this because when the believer dies, that obviously there's the body and the spirit are separated. But we believe the person is still that person in heaven. So clearly, dualism is the way things are. I don't think that's true. I don't think that explains all of the things that we know about our spirits and our bodies, and I'm going to tell you why. But that's one thing this is what he's talking about when he says the dualist. So Descartes gave us the dualist self, humans being spirit and body being a meat machine, right? This is just the vessel by which the real you is using this while we're in this life, and then when it's done with it, it leaves, and then, yay, we're still us. That's the dualist. But what he's saying is, that's just one step away from the atheist to come along and say, okay, well, we don't believe in God, and we don't even need a spirit, because what evidence is there? Look at all this great evidence we have for the physical world. There's no evidence for the non-physical world. So we're just machines. So once you've separated the two, you can jettison one of them, and that's the basis that Darwin and I mean materialism is the belief that humans are just material. They built a whole belief system of who we are all the way up to 2019, going through Kinsey and Sanger and Mead and everybody right through the 1960s. So you see how philosophy does matter, especially your view of man. The opposite of dualism is something called hylomorphism. If you want to write down $1 million word that no one's gonna, but it's fun to throw out every once in a while. Like, I know how. Oh, do you believe in hylomorphism? Like, what? You've not heard of hylomorphism? It was introduced by Aristotle. The word actually didn't get created by him, but if you remember, okay, I want to go back to this. Is a block of granite, let's say. This is the sculptor. So I'm not going to get into the causes right now. This is his whole system of causation, which, by the way, this is an argument against transgenderism right here, using Aristotle. Remember I told you about that pastor that graduated from SES? He did his dissertation, because he works in D.C., he's a pastor there, and the people in his church need to go to Capitol Hill and make arguments as to why transgenders should not be able to serve in the military, for example. But he can't quote scripture because it'll get shot down as being religious. So he did his dissertation on how to disprove transgenderism using only Aristotle, not even cracking open a Bible, so that he as a pastor could train his parishioners who, oh, by the way, are senators and four-star generals that work at the Pentagon, policymakers in all four branches of the military. So he teaches them how to do this. And he uses these four causes as one of the two ways that he defeats trans. And it's amazing. It's a thing of beauty. You see it, you're like, oh, they have nowhere to go. They can't argue against it. It's great. But I'm not going to do that right now. Okay. So hylomorphism. The dualist will say this. Let's say you're making a statue out of bronze, and you make a statue of Hermes, the god Hermes. This is what Plato will say. And it's Hermes. Okay, that's the form and the matter. The form is, what it looks like. The matter is the bronze. But say you're done with that statue, you melt it down, and then you fashion it into what's another Greek god that, I guess Zeus, okay. Go to Zeus. I always get the Greeks and the Romans kind of mixed up there. So you want to make a statue of Zeus. Now you have the same matter, right? The metal, the bronze, is the exact same bronze, but now it's in the form of Zeus. So Plato would say, see, the matter is completely irrelevant. It's what the form is that is the most important. So he's separating form and matter. That's another word for soul and spirit. Yeah, I hate studying philosophy because every time you say something, you're like, well, not quite. And by the time you're done being real precise, nobody understands what you're saying. So for the time being, just know that I know I'm not using the words in every instance, form and matter, do not always mean what I'm saying right now.
I was gonna call you out on that.
Yeah, I know. That's why I mentioned it.
I saw that.
I saw you pull out, okay, I'm gonna come back later. I'm gonna go tell Richard Howe on him. Okay, so the form and the matter is the same as the soul and the spirit in this application. Okay, so let's look at that. So you see what Plato's trying to say. It's the same thing as the substance dualist would say. That they would point out that I die, I go into the ground, I decompose, and literally my molecules, this always kind of weirds me out, my molecules, like that molecule right there, is almost certainly the same molecule that was part of some other human being thousands of years ago. Isn't that kind of weird? Because it's just this organic matter that's circulating around the biosphere. It's only so much of it. It's a closed system. So, and if you're a vegetarian, don't think you're off the hook, Jen, because vegetables are also absorbing the decomposed body parts of animals that are eating the decomposed body parts of other animals. And I mean, eventually, there are only so many. So the analogy of the bronze is exactly what we have to deal with as humans, except instead of bronze, we have just biotic matter. Dirt, yeah, and carbon and all the different nutrients that make up the living systems, both plant and animals. So you see the problem that they say is a problem. At least you see the situation. So you have people die, we decompose, our spirits go to heaven. So the body must be secondary, not as important. It's the real you is the spirit. Hylomorphists would come along and they say, no, you, Eric Lazo. I've been saying Lazo my whole time I've known that family. And I found out just, 3 or 4 weeks ago that I've been saying it wrong. And how do you retrain yourself? Like, you didn't correct me
I've been
sooner.
holding a grudge for years.
I know, right? You didn't tell me earlier. Like, come on, man, my name's Lazo.
No, it's not.
I know, I wanted to see if you were listening. Okay, so Eric, L, is the soul-body unit. That's Eric. If you separate it, it's not Eric anymore. That's hylomorphism. So the beauty of that is that you are you. The material is not, the matter that you're made up of is not evil, bad. If you read the footnotes in your study Bible, you see the word Gnosticism a lot. The Gnostics were people who believed that matter was evil and only the spiritual was the godly, and that's why we die. And that, but the problem with that is the second person of the Trinity took on matter. He added to his nature a second nature, which includes physical.
Is that why when he was resurrected and he wasn't always easily recognizable at first by folks, is that there was something different about his resurrected form, right? So talking about form again. So there's the form of Jesus as he was born, and then there's another form which was his resurrection form, right? Is there?
Yeah, and this is the strength of this. I think this way of looking at nature of the physical world. There's a guy at Southeastern who actually just is now the president of New Orleans Baptist. Did his second dissertation. He did 2 doctorates. The second one was on hylomorphism and the doctrine of the resurrection. So he was geeking out on Aristotelian hylomorphism. So the Baptists do this stuff, guys. This is cool. He says that, and I totally agree with him. Why do we need resurrection bodies? Because that's a doctrine that's not talked about as much, but the full breadth of human history, Genesis, we are perfect humans, we screwed up, all this history between now and then, Jesus, redeeming in between there, and then God comes down and redoes everything so that we're physical living in perfection, in perfect union with Him. That's the eschatos, the new world, right? New earth. Why does He have to recreate or if you believe he just reorganizes this world, either way, it's still a physical world that we will be living in forever. That's the final existence of Christians, not heaven, the current heaven. The current heaven is gone in the new heaven and new earth. It's like a holding place right now. It's God's presence, you're immediately present with God in the current heaven. Nothing of that is taken away. Why do we need new bodies? And this guy's argument, Jamie Dew's his name, from Southeastern, he said, because that's what it means to be human. And in soul body, or the body soul, either way, you can't pull them apart and still be Eric Lazo. You can't. So what's the problem you're introducing? Well, are all the people up there right now not them? See, that immediately is, some of you probably already were thinking that. The Bible presents like, say, the rich man and Lazarus. You know, the rich man and Lazarus are both who they are. The rich man, we don't know about Lazarus because we don't see him up close and personal in that story. But the rich man is talking about his loved ones that are still alive, himself, he remembers his life. He's still him. Lazarus is still him in heaven. And then, of course, the martyrs are under the throne of heaven. How long, O Lord, until our martyrdom is avenged, our blood is avenged? Well, it doesn't make any sense if they're not fully them anymore. So what do you do with that is the question. And this is not what I was planning on talking about, but it's an objection that you have to answer as hylomorphous. What we would say is that God supernaturally graces those believers and keeps their memories intact, their person, everything that made them who they are in this life, subtract the sin and the effects of sin, and that's who they are right there, and God is certainly capable of doing that. And then when he recreates their body, puts them back in there, that's the continuity between now, heaven, and then. That's what we would say is hylomorphous. That maintains the dignity of the human, of the flesh. I mean, why is it that modesty is important? Why is it that taking care of ourselves is important? Why is it? I mean, because we're not Gnostics. We don't think that this stuff is evil, anchoring us to this decrepit world. God created the physical world, including us, and said it's good. Right? So I think it's really important to think this through. Now, if you come down the side of being a substance dualist, don't worry, there are a lot of Christians who do think that. I'm not sure what percentage of what, but I just don't think it's as satisfying. And like Benjamin Weicker is saying, is substance dualism gives people like Kinsey, Freud, Marx, anybody that's a materialist, it gives them not an excuse, but it gives them the philosophical framework in which to say we're just mechanistic and I'm going to proceed accordingly. So that's the problem with substance dualism. That doesn't mean it's false. I think it's false because of these other things that I've discussed. But you see what Weicher's saying there about the dualism on that quote? Does that make more sense now?
Just have one question.
Mm-hmm.
What's in the ground? Like when we go to the funeral and we leave.
It's a vessel, right? It's to be absent from the body is to be present with Christ. So who you are absent from that. So my dad, he's I've told you guys before, he's suffering severe Alzheimer's, hasn't talked in years now. We talked a lot about these kinds of things, in which I'm so grateful. I have no questions in my mind of what his attitude was about these things. And one of the things he said was, guys, don't go all out on a funeral for me. It's not me. He goes, you're going to be standing, if you guys need to do something, a service so you can feel better about it, it's all for you. He goes, the person that's dead, if they're Christians, this isn't for them. There's nothing that we have to do for them. Service is for us to process it, to make the memories have meaning and whatnot. But yeah, that's just a collection of molecules. So then the question comes in, like, well, what is God going to reanimate at the end times? So this is one of the reasons why, just like everything else, Catholics take it too far and go off on the deep end. This is why they're against cremation. Because, well, you burn it all, but what about people who die in a shipwreck?
So the argument I've heard against that
Or get eaten.
is not that it's wrong or sin, but that it's a greater respect to treat the body, to not.
I've heard that.
It's a little
Right.
more respect. For example, Grandma, my mom's mom, was cremated. We couldn't have her ashes in the church for the funeral. They would not let them in the service. So it's more, they think something sinful has happened.
But in the
And-
Protestant world, I'm saying I've heard the argument, it's also.
In the Protestant world,
more
maybe.
respectful to.
Could be.
To bury, because it kind of represents also kind of the.
Right.
The burial, and kind of what Jesus is buried and rise,
See, I'm-
I heard in the Bible, pagans burned.
That's right.
And Christians did not.
Some Christians might say that too. Yeah,
Pagans burned.
I don't have any problem with it. I just think Catholics, because they are hylomorphous, because they're Thomist, Aristotelian, the philosophy is based on that. That's why they are against cremation. I think that's a wrong application of that doctrine, but of course,
And I've also heard
everything
that,
else they do.
You bury someone facing the east as a witness that they are going to meet Jesus when he comes and, raises
What does
him.
east have to do with it?
He comes from
Comes
the east.
Coming
from the
Rise
east.
when they rise
Yeah.
up.
But there's east as to who, I'm just.
I know, that's the thing that's so
Fine, I'm
funny.
not to the west. I look really far that way.
And what do they think? They're gonna miss the rapture?
All the way around the world in the rapture.
Like as a witness, to.
Jesus' work of redemption would not be complete if it did not include the body.
Exactly.
No matter if it was cremated or not.
Right, yeah.
And the Bible's very clear about that. Our bodies will be like Jesus' resurrection body. That's what we have to look forward to.
That's right.
If you want to read a really cool book on that, it's called Heaven by Randy Alcorn. And he says, all right, it says this, it says that. Okay, let's just be imaginative here. He ate fish, right? So we're going to have some eating ability at least, not to live, because we can't starve to death in the new earth, but we'll be able to enjoy food, it looks like. And he said, well, there are other things too, like he was seemingly walking through walls, he was in a locked room, or they were in a locked room, he was there, then he wasn't, all these cool things. And he starts getting kind of creative on, man, what will it be like in eternity? We'll be physical, but we're going to be better than we are now, but we're still us. And yes, that's exactly right. This is why it's important, I think, hylomorphism, is that it shows that that's why it was such a big deal that Jesus took on, or that the Son took on the flesh. Substance dualism, we did the Trinity back in the Doctrine of God class, and some of the wrong views of the incarnation is that Jesus is the Son, which would be the Spirit, ensouling the body, which was Jesus. So he had a divine spirit, but a physical body. But how does that make him human? Then obviously that was dismissed as a heresy because he's not fully human then. Jesus of Nazareth is a hylomorphically united body and soul, that's human nature, who has a second nature, the Son, that's hypostatically united with him, using all the cool words here in one. That's Jesus. He's the only one that's ever, it's not gonna be like that's the incarnated Son of God, just like that one over there. You see how both of them are, no, there's only one. So we have to just do our best to describe it and not make any mistakes. When we say Jesus was fully human, and the Bible says he was fully human, that means he has a human soul, not a divine soul. That's how we can understand. Otherwise, if he's not fully human, how is he connected with Adam? And more personally, how is he connected with us if he doesn't have human nature? He's connected because we all are humans, not individual creations that are completely separate from one another. That's how original sin passes, and that's how the redemption happens. So, I don't know how Kinsey, but the answer to Kinsey is this, I think, and it has all these implications to other doctrines here. And Benjamin Weicker, he is a Catholic, and so he would hold to hylomorphism as he's clearly doing with Descartes, and he's talking about the problem is if you start looking at us as a meat machine, even if you think there's a soul, you've introduced a problem that doesn't exist by saying that we're a meat machine with a soul, or in the case of the atheist, there's no soul, it's just a machine.
So like number 3 of the Texas University, Texas State
Which one?
University.
That was the one about,
Yeah, number 3 is we agree with them.
let's go back to it. If of course, homosexuality is immoral. You don't see it in any animals doing that.
We agree that that is
But we do
that
see
there-
animals doing it.
Maybe
But that argument is not a good argument.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're saying, right, they're saying that
They
these are
mean
bad
it, they mean it
examples.
as a jab to us, but we're like, well,
Right.
we agree.
When you look at the full list, they jab on both sides. I thought, okay, that's fair, but some Christians do
Yeah,
use this
I think what
argument.
they're
but-
jabbing at right, is that there, for a long time, there's a lot of,
Yeah, that was our only argument.
Right.
For a lot of the old
Which is-
anti-intellectual branch of.
But ever since Kinsey, mankind has known that no, animals do behave that way. But, yeah, it's not homosexuality in the animal kingdom. It's them just doing their business, like I said, with the leg. That's it. Okay. So first of all, Kinsey didn't even answer the original question. This is back to, I'd like to point this out. Classical apologetics starts with truth, then using good reasoning and truth, you demonstrate that God exists. If God exists, then miracles are possible, and this God could reveal himself to mankind, because that's what a miracle is, revelation. That's why that point's important. Then you look at the holy books to see what contenders do we have, and you put the Bible on trial. And I don't mean that in any kind of sacrilegious way, but you as a thinker are saying, well, is this God's word? 'Cause I've got this, I got the Book of Mormon, I've got the Quran, so is this, then you examine the Word of God, especially the New Testament, you say, yeah, this is historically reliable, I have every reason to believe that this is the Word of God. If God wrote it, he can't make mistakes because he's God. That's why it's infallible, that's why it's inerrant. So you get this whole system here. Now you got this guy coming along saying, I'm going to say all these things that are false. We as Christian apologists, trained classically, will say, well, let's go back. You say this, that humans are just material. Why do you think humans are just material? Well, because of this. Well, but that's not obviously true. Let's go back a step. And that, real soon we're to the main question of, does God exist? Does truth exist? Is truth about reality knowable? All the things that we do in the I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, which is just a modern version of classical apologetics, we would do in reverse with someone like Kinsey. And just point out that Kinsey, Freud, whoever you are that are doing doctoral dissertations on these things, everything you say is based on God not existing, but nowhere in your arguments do you ever demonstrate that that's the case. Let's go back and examine that. What do you say about the arguments for God's existence? Aquinas' 5 ways, the teleological, all the many 1,500 years of the best minds have written really good arguments for God's existence. And these guys just ignore it like it wasn't. Yeah, mankind hasn't had much to say on the topic, so I'm just going to move on. That's just laziness and bad scholarship on their part.
Eric, what was the impact of all of this? So I know I missed the beginning, but what impact did this book have? You said 1948.
1948.
So post-World War II, kind of
Right.
trying to think of the mindset and how was this accepted?
This, along with primarily Samoa, the one we did last week, Coming of Age in Samoa, but all the others that we've been talking about factor in. Rousseau, of course, factors in. But in America, those two in particular, that's what gave rise to the sexual revolution. And of course, with this, I would include the sexual habits of the American female. Same argument, he's just doing one for male, one for female. That's what the sexual revolution was quoting or standing on, saying, we're going to do this exactly like they said, so we're liberated. Back to my original complaint, and even back with when we start with the apologetics and do that timeline of various thinkers that were introduced, and we can't find Christians in the literature, say Freud in Vienna. Where were the Vietnamese Christian intellectuals who were arguing, hey, Freud, you can't say that unless it's true that people don't have spirits and there is no God. They weren't doing these arguments. And in these cases here, the same thing. Some earlier on, people may have argued against Machiavelli because that was in the 1600s. But here you've got 1948. They had what they needed. They meaning Christian intellectuals. But nobody was arguing against him from this angle. They may have been throwing their arms up. Now this is where I have to be careful, but I still want to say it. 1948. That's roughly the time that Billy Graham was coming into prominence. He was preaching already before during the war. After the war, the Crusades in the 50s was sort of the heyday of the Crusades. So I'll just say that if everybody that came forward in a Billy Graham crusade was being redeemed, mind, soul, body, spirit, growing in the Lord, and those were real salvations, then that was happening at the same time that this guy wrote this book. He wrote his follow-up book in '54. They could look back and look at the Samoan book. They could look at Freud. Nobody was writing. Nobody was saying, here are the arguments, church, for this. Until the 1960s, when Schaeffer comes on the scene. He's already in the midst of the sexual revolution. He says, oh my gosh, the forest is on fire. What do we need to do? So he wasn't foreshadowing it. We're in the midst of it. And he went back and he did all this stuff. He looked at the philosophy of all these thinkers and he built a good apologetic against them. Other than him, and the thing that's interesting here is Lewis had already written Mere Christianity, Problem of Evil. Lewis had, there was material there. It wasn't like Christianity, the church didn't do anything that average Christians like us could have read. You guys have read enough Lewis to, okay, he's deep, but you can read him. It's not like a textbook. He's writing to the lay person. The indictment I'm saying is for myself to not fall asleep at the wheel, for all of you and for our church and where you're going to church, Christians in America, we can't do it again. We're in the forest and fire again with gay marriage and everything that we have going on against us. So we're in the midst of it like Schaeffer was. But what's coming in 5 years from now, 10 years from now down the road, be thinking Christians, equip our kids, equip each other in the church and in the schools. We can't let it happen again because look at the carnage. Some of the books that we covered, by the way, we did Marx, of course, Communist Manifesto, Mein Kampf, Nietzsche that led to Mein Kampf. And we just pointed out that if you take Nazism and communism, you're talking about 100 million plus people were murdered. Not accidentally, like just as a side effect, because of these beliefs. People carried out these beliefs to the letter, and 100 plus million people were murdered because of it. That doesn't count all the people's lives that were ruined and people that were uprooted and all that. So we're talking about major, major, major consequences, possibly, that come from a bad idea. So
I wanted to bring up because this verse in our Sunday school lesson, and when I read this, I thought about your question, that exact question, and just listen to this. And this is Paul writing to Timothy. He says, but shun profane and idle babblings, for they will increase more godliness, and their message will spread. This version says like cancer, but a lot of versions say like gangrene. Mm-hmm. So I mean, Billy Graham, did that, but these idle messages and babblings have a way of, Paul's saying what you're saying, but that's...
Yeah, he saw it. One of the verses that I think is in Jude, I think it's Jude. Paul says that one of the reasons you study theology, he did philosophy. Remember, he quoted Greek poets and Greek philosophers. He knew his stuff. Romans is classical apologetics. It goes from, this is Paul we're talking about. And he said, one of the reasons you'd study this stuff, you guys know what he said? It's kind of forceful. To shut the mouths of people who are talking garbage, nonsense, depending on the translation. He's talking in the church. He first says, these things are happening. You who know better need to go against these people to shut them up. There's a little, Paul was not afraid of some conflict or a little. So one of the reasons we study this stuff is to nip these things in the bud before they become cancerous and all the things.
But it shows that he is saying these bad ideas have extreme power, right, that even overcome sometimes the good.
Yeah, they do. They stifle the good. There is a point. Another famous quote that I can't remember who said it, but the quote, Ravi Zacharias uses it all the time, that there are ideas that are so powerful and so bad that one day they're gonna move an army against another, and then thousands or millions of people will die. But it started out as just a book that was published, or an idea. That's when we need to combat it, before, the Nazi army goes across the border into Poland. At that time, the only thing you can do is fight with bombs and missiles, and that's all you got left. But we have an opportunity, and I do think that the gay marriage debate, the LGBT, this is a battlefield. It's not the only thing that's going on. Remember that picture I showed a week or two ago of the islands and the lava coming up underneath? We're talking about the lava. We talked about like the island chain of Hawaii, and sometimes we look at gay marriage or evolution or life issues, and as though they're these separate islands, but really you look down, it's the same crack in the earth that's spewing lava. So we as thinking Christians have to understand that's the battle down there. It's totally legitimate and right to fight all these battles separately. Family Research Council, great, do your thing. American Family, do your thing. But we have to have somebody that's trying to close the fault from leaking more lava. And that's philosophy. That's doing good philosophically informed theology and apologetics. So that's what we're trying to do here is LGBTQ is an island, but it isn't the fight. It's all these fundamental things that they're making mistakes that are based on fundamental lies, falsehoods. And so we need to pick them out. But I do think that's a major battlefield that we haven't even. By the way, substance dualism versus holomorphism and androids, humanoid androids, robotics. The Japanese have their Shintoism believes that inanimate objects can be ensouled, that spirits can come into objects that aren't even machines. So they have no problem with humanoid robots being fully human in the same sense that they are, because they just look at themselves as a machine, and an ensouled machine. So is this. It's one reason why robotics took off in Japan before it did here. That's one issue that I think down the road is going to be something that people are going to have to talk about, because legislators are already talking about giving First Amendment rights, for example, to things. It's like your stapler has the right to habeas corpus or something. And then there's self-driving cars. This is just using technology. Who's going to program the cars? Is PETA, the people with the ethical treatment of animals, going to program the car and tell it, as you're making a decision about who to hit and not to hit, humans and the dog and the child walking the dog are of equal value? These are real questions that Christians can give answers to that are years or decades down the road. And I can't even think of other ones, but did we ever think 10 years ago that the Supreme Court was going to legalize gay marriage? I didn't. Remember we were all pushing for an amendment, what do you call it, a convention?
Convention of States?
Where we can come in and ratify the Constitution or make a change. We were talking about doing that stuff because we were so confident that we were going to be able to get all these good things in there. I'm glad it didn't happen now, because look at what might have happened. The Constitution itself may have been ripped apart, and what is happening from the Supreme Court.
You think we have a sodomite running for president who spouts scripture?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are scary about our current political landscape.
Why Kingsley only wrote 2 books on the male and the female? Did he not know that there was all these other genders?
Exactly. Well, he was a
Where are the other books?
He was a bigot. Why didn't he say the sexual habits of the dog? Yeah, well, he died. Maybe he would have. What if he would have lived in the '60s? I don't know. He would have loved it, I'm sure.
He's
So
no longer an atheist.
Yeah, it's not. No, that's for sure. So, any questions? Additional
I
comments?
think we need to teach that picture sometime or other.
It's awesome stuff. I don't think it's too hard to understand, but it is getting into Greek philosophy, and I think it's profound. We had to memorize them and cite them for a test. I remember that's when it clicked for me, like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense. When you start thinking like the way those Greeks used to talk, a little bit, then they were really intelligent, thoughtful people. They were not ancients that didn't know anything. They were smarter than most Americans, honestly. They knew more about science than most Americans do. So,
What was the name of the man that wrote the dissertation?
This one here, Marty Baker, and I've posted his talk from the conference on our group before, so you can go back and look at one of the postings. He did a lay-level presentation of his dissertation at last year's Apologetics Conference. A really good presentation, and of course doesn't go as deep as he did in his dissertation, but he goes through the four causes, and he goes through Aristotelian logic, opposite truths, false.
So is his dissertation available online at all? You know?
No, they were going to publish it. One of the issues he has is getting in trouble. Not legally, because he First Amendment rights, but he could lose his church. The church could get attacked. It actually, literally, his house did get attacked. So thanks for joining us. I hope that we didn't scare you away. We promise in 2 weeks from now we won't talk about, yeah, we will. It's the feminine mystique. 3 weeks from now we will not talk about sex. But he actually, the gay activists started giving him death threats. He had to get a concealed carry license just to protect himself and his wife. They poured white powder into his HVAC, and so they couldn't go in the house. They had to get hazmat showed up, and it turned out it was talcum powder or something like that. But this is the kind of stuff that happens. That was before he published before he did his dissertation. He was just preaching through his dissertation, and he showed me some of the emails. It's sick, it's violent, it's hateful. These people are not friendly. There's another thing to look at in the closed group. We have that video from the Heritage Foundation of 3 lesbians and a former transgender who dared to say that, no, you're not. Substance dualism, you can see this here. Substance dualism, you could be a female trapped in a man's body, or vice versa, if we're just ensouled in a machine, but we got the wrong machine. Not their fault, they're in the wrong machine. That's what the transgender argument is. Well, if you're hylomorphous, you say, nope, that's wrong right away, because you're not, a certain kind of soul that just got mismatched in the wrong kind of body. This stuff has implications on all sorts of fronts. But go scroll through our timeline. I've posted some goodies through the years, last couple of years. I think that we should repost them.
Now, some people think we're 3 parts now, don't they?
Yeah, but what they mean by that, because in theology we do have
5-part and tripartite.
Right, but they're talking theologically, not metaphysically. So like body, soul, and spirit. There's the Bible talks sometimes dualistically, sometimes.
But it's still. I mean,
2 weeks.
They're I think talking theologically, but it's still as. The bipart is the.
Even hylomorphous. This is important to say. We recognize that the soul is not the same thing as the body. We're not saying they're the same thing. That's called monism. See.
Yeah.
Monism is that they're the same thing. We do believe, but we're saying how are they related to each other? We're saying hylomorphically, not dualistically.
Yeah.
So that's the difference. Okay, we're nerding out here, but it's an important distinction because you're right. Body, soul, spirit. I think it's more just language to talk about the whole you, like Jesus says, love me, love God with all your heart.
Yeah, this is a philosophical thing here, but with the theological, it's a thematic thing.
And right, and you have to obviously be careful that sometimes the Bible is using philosophical language like logos. It is borrowing from the Greek understanding of logos. Did you find it?
Yeah,
it's totally worth it. It's less than an hour because it's a conference talk, and you'll be like, yeah, it's a great argument.
It was April 10th.
Did I post it?
Yeah.
Okay, so there you go. April 10th on the closed group. It's Marty Baker, Pastor Marty Baker, Dr. Martin Baker, and transgenders. What's it called? Is it illogical? I think it's why transgenderism.
Yeah,
is
transgenderism, logical. It's MP3 file.
Yeah.
Oh, is
Is it
transgenderism logical?
So
Delusional.
it is. Yeah. He's just talking about their argument. Does it even make sense? Because if something, that's the other thing too. If something is false or if something is illogical, you don't even have to bother with anything else. At that point, it's false. I don't have to even. So if you remember from undergraduate or high school logic, you have validity and soundness of an argument. if someone's argument is not valid, in other words, it's like, it's using the wrong structure of logic, you don't have to even ask, are the premises true? Because it's false. The conclusion, I don't have to accept the conclusion could be true, but not for those reasons. So sometimes we can save ourselves a ton of time and fights at Thanksgiving with brothers-in-laws by just pointing that out. So something like, well, you can't call capitalists immoral if there's no God or there's no human nature. Why, where do you get the authority, I guess you could say, to say that the 1%ers are unethically taking advantage of the 99%? That's the argument that everyone wants to have at Thanksgiving now. Because you said there's no God, there's no such thing as human nature. Well, then we're just meat machines, and it's just absolutely dead on arrival to say that the 1% shouldn't take advantage of the 99%. Right? So, in the animal kingdom, it's like that. The strong will always beat the weak. So we should encourage that in humans if you're a materialist.